I am your humble servant, Eric Romero. Pleased to be here. Originally, I'm from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, more specifically the foothills of the Oaxacoyas, known as the Spanish Peaks. I'm from my father's garden and my mother's kitchen. And I frame that in a sense that, you know, that upbringing is very much part of my character, my personality, part of my cultural identity. And I wanted to start off with this discussion, and please feel comfortable if you have a question or a clarification, you wish for me to repeat something, please let's do it by means of a raised hand or catch my attention. Ms. Velasquez will help to monitor that. So feel comfortable being part of the conversation. The conversation is titled, I have it up here, Food Tradition and Food Story. And I want to kind of make this linkage of the importance of understanding a story of food as a story of ourselves and as a continuing narrative as to how we are all storytellers. And oftentimes much of our storytelling involves mundane, daily, quotidian practices such as eating. In fact, I'm constantly reminded of that when I get on social media and I see how often people are still sharing their luncheon plates or what they had cooked up, what they envisioned of. Sometimes I wonder if those are really true images when they say, I cooked these lamb ribs and it has the little things on them. And I'm saying, no, that looks to me like they took it out of a magazine. But nonetheless, we speak much about our food. And again, because it is so important, it's part of a cultural identity. And I want to make this relationship that when we speak about food traditions or landed traditions, it's within our interest to go far back and go into a historical orientation, more so these intercultural and intergenerational histories, because it helps us make sense of things. Part of my academic work here at Highland has been working in social linguistics, areas of linguistic, and particularly in narrative formation. I wrote my dissertation, my PhD dissertation. I wrote it with the title of Narrative Formation of New Mexico Place Identity. So it's how, by the manner of how we tell stories, we're creating our cultural identity. We're inventing ourselves, presenting ourselves in story, narrative, and anecdote is a primary format for us to be able to share not only who we are, but how do we want to present ourselves. And so this idea of speaking about food tradition and speaking it from a historical perspective anchors us, because you really don't become part of a place, you don't become part of a community, have that place attachment, that place identity, unless you incorporate the story of those that preceded you. That's why it's very important for us to look at ancestries, look at heritage, and say, these are the stories of old. These are my recollection or my understanding of these stories. And to the degree that we listen to those stories, we incorporate, we internalize those stories, we become part of a place, we insert ourselves. That's the idea of place identity. And for Hispanics in northern New Mexico, we even have a specific concept for it. We call it querencia. Querencia is the notion of being part of a place, being part of a landscape, part of a community. And what I'm suggesting is to truly do so means that you know the histories before you, you know what had happened here. And so for me, this idea of food is also a wonderful venue, an adventure for us to see what has happened before us and how it literally shows up on our plate today in 2021. So I want to go a little bit into this food history and kind of frame the idea that what we have right now as contemporary culinary practices makes a whole lot more sense when you understand the bigger history as to what are the processes, what's the cuisine, what are the ingredients. And I can guarantee you those enchiladas are going to taste a whole lot better once you understand how this came about and how it's part of a regional history that's very unique in the Southwest, and therefore something for us to tie into, again, this cultural heritage pattern of understanding, why do we eat like this? Why are the foodstuffs so popular, and the cooking strategies, why have we had these in place for quite some time? So I'm going to jump back and forth with some slides that I prepared. Hopefully it doesn't get too tedious in jumping back and forth, but if you allow me to do this. And I'm still a technology neophyte, so please bear with me if I'm slow. I'll try to be nice. So let me start off and first of all kind of identify it. Give me a thumbs up. Can you see my little cursor, my little arrow? So this is where we're at. We're right around here. We're in a border zone between what's historically understood as the Native American cultural area of the Southwest and the Native American cultural area of the Plains. And we've been influenced by some of these different areas by means of trade and technological and food sharings. But for the better part, we want to frame this idea that particularly here in Las Vegas, we live in a border culture, and this border culture has went on for quite some time. Las Vegas is the border of the mountains and the plains. And that's not just a topography or geography. There's some meaning that's attached to it, because the food of the mountains is different than the food of the plains. The indigenous populations of the mountains and the deserts are different than the indigenous populations of the plains. And so therefore we start off with this big understanding of cultural mixings and how they become incarnate here within our food traditions. We are definitely a demonstration of the histories before us. So this is a really interesting map. This is called a Native American cultural spaces map. And I want to point out, particularly when you look in this area here, that Southwestern indigenous culture doesn't stop at the contemporary border with Mexico. In fact, it extends way far down into Mexico, and the border cultures here in Mexico are Mesoamerican cultures. And that's going to become important for us to understand the relationship between the Southwest and these Mesoamerican cultures that are further down deep in Mexico. Also, with our food tradition, we're borrowing from the Plains group. We're borrowing from Great Basin and such. And so again, with our little trip, we're going to go pretty far back. So let's start off with original inhabitants. And we always want to do a land acknowledgement of recognizing indigenous peoples have been here before, and these will always be considered Native American indigenous lands. And we want to show our respect and recognize that part of the reason they're not here is because some of the ideas on progress and colonialism have appropriated their lands and displaced them from ancestral lands. So as a land acknowledgement, I want to mention that. But let's give a deeper land acknowledgement of saying it isn't just a recognition of saying they were here before us, but they've left vestiges, they've left ideas, they've left story. And again, I repeat, for us to become part of this place, we want to respect those stories and respect and recognize those remnants and those vestiges of what they've left us, including our food traditions and cultural practices and behaviors and language as well. It shows up in our local language. So these are some images of Paleo-Indian groups. And again, we don't necessarily have written or oral histories from them, but we have record, we have physical remains and physical record that gives us some idea of how these people lived and behaved, and to some degree where their thought processes were. And more so, we want to look at their foodstuffs. These are hunter-gatherer populations. And within the discussions on archaeology, some of them place that in New Mexico, they've been here maybe 15,000 years, maybe 20,000 years, maybe 25,000 years ago. There's been human occupation here in this area in New Mexico that we call Northern New Mexico, Southern Colorado, in Las Vegas, San Miguel County in particular. So these were big game hunters and gatherers, and big game in that, I'm not sure if everybody recognizes, they hunted elephants. Mammoths and mastodons were on the plate. Raise your hand, how many of you have ate elephant? Anybody? Hippo? How about bison? How many of you have ate bison? I want to look at this. I want to see how many of you have ate bison. Can I see a show of hands? How many of you have ate bison? Yum, yum. So the ancients, they were hunting a different kind of bison. The bison that they hunted is now extinct, but it was twice the size of our contemporary bison. The horn span may have been as much as 8 to 9 feet from one tip to the other. These were huge, huge animals. And of course, these indigenous peoples hunted them with spears and bow and arrow. Sometimes they stampeded them off of a cliff and collected them or dispatched them, a wounded animal at the top of the hill. But again, these are hunter-gatherer populations. So this is a diet. In fact, interesting enough, if you hit some of the health food stores and some of the new trendy areas of diet and cuisine, you see something called the paleo diet. Now, paleo diet basically makes a reference to pre-agricultural hunter-gatherer foodstuffs. And again, my suggestion is for us to recognize we actually do this. Some of our families, some of our members are still hunting. Some of our families, some of our members are still gathering. In fact, if you recognize these foodstuffs, these are still very, very common in New Mexico kitchens. So this is capulin. Capulin makes a beautiful jam. I think I could say it makes a good wine. If you tried capulin wine, you know that it's more, it may be more popular than a cognac or a good tequila. There's a premium on it. That family member that gave you a bottle of choke cherry capulin wine for Christmas, they're at the top of your favorite relatives list. And we also have, does everybody know what cota is? Give me some feedback. What do we use cota for? You could chime in.
We usually use it for urinary tract infections.
Yeah, it helps out with intestinal, but it also tastes good. We drink it as a summer tea. And cota, that's what these plants are. They're on all kinds of streets and highways and such. If you know what you're looking for, it's a very abundant plant. And right now, the harvest of cota is still taking place, but it's good for urinary tract infection. It's good for digestive issues. It's also used as an astringent. Okay, this one down here, this is verdolaga. If you're familiar with verdolaga, anywhere you're at, if you go out and walk for 2 minutes, you're going to find some verdolaga plants on the ground. Or as well, quelites. Okay, verdolaga is purslane, the English word for purslane. And of course, quelites. Quelites, often called wild spinach, in English is called lamb's quarters. So again, very, very tasty, very nutritious, and very common in our yards and backyards and neighbors' yards. Don't get caught. Unless, of course, they invite you. As little kids, we used to make our spare money doing household chores for the neighbors. And so whenever they would hire us to go cut weeds, every once in a while they'd come and say, well, we can't pay you because you didn't cut all the weeds. And we say, well, those aren't weeds. Those are verdolagas and cota and quelites. You know, those aren't weeds. You eat that stuff. And so we've always had that discussion of what's good planting, what's yerba mala, what's bad planting, what are weeds. But anyway, I frame this idea of that hunter-gatherer tradition may be still in place with our communities. And maybe you're going to the mountains for Oshai as a medicinal plant. Maybe you're going up for you have an idea as to where the ciruela cimarron, the wild red plums are at. Maybe you're going for mushrooms in the mountains or something. Again, a lot of hunter-gatherer tradition is still taking place, and many of us still adhere to an idea that gathering your food is viable and doable. Now, within the history of the world, the history of the planet, we could argue as to, you know, what are the most significant events in place? The invention of the printing press, the television, the invention of Facebook. You know, you could always argue as to what was the most important and far-reaching invention or innovation. For most historians, one of the biggest events in the history of the world is the agricultural revolution, when people start growing their food rather than hunting and gathering. And so it happens coterminously throughout the planet within actually a short time frame. And there's an interesting discussion as to how that takes place. Some people even say, well, it's because of ancient aliens coming in and introducing agricultural technologies. I don't lend much credence to that, but you know, it could have been. But anyway, the agricultural revolution as it takes place in in the Middle East, 12,000 years ago, Tigris, Euphrates river systems, the Golden Crescent, Mesopotamia. In the Americas, this happens about 7,000 years ago. And it happens in Mesoamerica, down here. If you can see my little cursor, it happens in this area, east of the mountains, in the valleys of what is contemporary, what is now the state of Puebla. And they start growing food, and then they start becoming a sedentary population. So as where hunter-gatherer populations are nomadic and moving and following the herds or always looking for foods, when you have agriculture, you could stay put. You could stay in one place and grow your food and live off the food. If you really get skillful at your agriculture, then you develop into civilization, and you have markets, you have governance, you have religious structures, you may even have science and art. Those are what we call civilizations. And it only comes around if you have significant enough of a food source that not everybody has to designate themselves to growing food. So this happens in Mesoamerica around 7,000 years ago. And lo and behold, look at that. Their main crops are the Three Sisters. I'll bet that at least a good percentage of you that are watching on this program, on this discussion, within the last week, you've had significantly some sampling of these corn, beans, and squash. These are, again, in agriculture, these are called the Three Sisters. They were first domesticated by the indigenous peoples in Mesoamerica, and eventually they find their way up. And domesticated means that there was a selection process. that they kept growing and saving the bigger ones, saving the tastier seeds. And so it becomes modified and changed to what the original food stuff would have been. In fact, if you're not familiar, corn, we're a corn people, we're a corn society, we're a corn civilization. Corn runs the planet. Corn is the chief grain of all grains, not wheat, not rye, not barley. Corn is probably the most abundant grain on the planet. As a grain, it starts off very small because corn is basically, it's grass seed. The corn plant is of the family of grasses, kind of like bamboo as well. Bamboo and corn are grass species. So the original corn, this teosine, look at that. There's a quarter for comparison. It's kind of rather small. But if you keep selecting the larger ones and modifying them as well, not GMO modification, but selective breeding, you eventually end up with some of these corn kernels. This last weekend, we roasted some corn for chicos, and some of those ears were a good 16, 18 inches large. So corn cultivation combined with beans and squash, that's a complete diet. It's almost like a little ecosystem that you create in your garden, in your plot, in your milpa. Now, corn, beans, and squash become very important in the Southwest as long as 4,000 years ago. Archaeological evidence starts demonstrating some forms of corn, bean, and squash cultivation as long as 2,000 years BC. But how did that corn, beans, and squash get here? Plane, train, automobile? How did those seeds get here? Anybody got an idea on that? Hi, Emily. If I'm suggesting that corn, bean, squash cultivation was in place maybe as much as 9,000 years ago in southern Mexico, how did it get here to the Southwest to be grown by Native American people in the Southwest? Amazon?
Migrational patterns?
Somebody brought those seeds up. Thank you, Alicia. Somebody brought those seeds up from Mexico. And this kind of ties into this bigger issue of networks and exchange, which is very much going to be part of our discussion today. Somebody brought it up. And guess who brought it up? A good friend of yours and mine, Coco Pelli. Does anybody have a Coco Pelli tattoo? Everybody recognizes this symbol. This is Coco Pelli. Coco Pelli, the bigger history is he's a seed bearer. He's a fertility deity. I have fun with him saying he was a rock star because he would come to villages, and as a fertility god, he would come to villages, he would play his flute, the fields would produce, and the women would get pregnant. And now we have, I got to show this, you know, and it's a whole different discussion right now, but, you know, a discussion on cultural appropriation. I have to mention, Coco Pelli is a deity. He's a god, but he's on beer companies. There's Coco Pelli board game. This is Coco Pelli real estate, Coco Pelli rafting adventures, Coco Pelli wine, Coco Pelli road stand, Coco Pelli skateboard. And now, most important is a coca pally face mask. How appropriate would be if we had this. But anyway, that, not to go lengthy into that idea of cultural appropriation, it's a common symbol here from the Southwest, but not too many people are familiar that this is referent to this large, important idea that food from Mexico made its way into the Southwest and then gets developed further into the Southwest. So this is the time frame from, maybe as much as 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago that you had our indigenous peoples here in Anasazi, Fremont, Hohokam, Mogollon. This is what we're calling these peoples. We're calling them Mimbres culture. And we don't know what they call themselves, but these are our words for them. But they were agriculturalists. And that was what set the Southwest apart from the rest of those cultural areas that I indicated in my first map, is that these people were growing their own food. They were sedentary. They had huge villages. And so no wonder that when the Spanish started exploring the area, they were very interested in New Mexico. It wasn't New Mexico, but they were interested in this area because of the agriculture in the villages, the sedentary villages that were already in place. We were good at corn, beans, squash, and eventually we get good at chili and other cultigens, other foodstuffs. So just real quick, some images. This is a scene of what a cornfield might have looked like. They modified the landscape, designed irrigation methodologies to be able to get waters to fields. And probably most emblematic of that is Chaco Canyon. How many, I hope all of you had a chance to go to Chaco Canyon. This is our backyard. This is from here from Las Vegas, 3.5 hours. And at one time, this was the center of the universe for indigenous peoples, not only in the Southwest, but very, very much for a part of what we now understand is the United States. Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon was this trade center. It was a spiritual center. It was a knowledge center. There was science and technology that was shared there. And certainly there was a lot of food sharing and cultural sharing and scientific agricultural sharing that was taking place. So this was the Vatican. This was New York City. This was Los Angeles. This was the center where indigenous people would go to learn new ideas and to share things. And it's right here just between Albuquerque and Farmington. If you've not had a chance to go up there, please check it out. And so from this trade from Chaco Canyon, exchange and trade went out through so many different areas. So food would come here, and then food would get distributed out here up above Four Corners areas, and they would bring food back. So part of that food that came back to New Mexico eventually finds its way into other different kind of recipes and food traditions, etc. In fact, can I see this? Show me, if you can, give me a show of hands. How many of you think that chocolate should be a food group in and of itself? Chocolate is food from the heavens. Chocolate is necessary. Chocolate has been up here in New Mexico for quite some time. We have archaeological evidence. If you're familiar with what we call hot chocolate, drinking chocolate in Mexico is called bate chocolate. And it's a frothed chocolate. You drink it as a liquid, as a cold drink. And they've been working for several thousand years in Mesoamerica. But they used to bring chocolate up to Chaco Canyon. And so part of Anasazi, it was part of their trade networks. We have recent discoveries that demonstrate that chocolate trade came all the way up from Chiapas and Guatemala, and even as far as away as some of the beans were found to be from contemporary Nicaragua and Costa Rica farms. Those trade networks were very, very extensive, and you had to carry that stuff in a backpack. So people were doing tremendously large voyages. So next time you're drinking your hot chocolate at home, you know, on a warm day, remember somebody carried it on their back for 2,000 miles. Or, well, maybe they got it here on a train or a plane. But at one time, they had to bring it on their back for over 2,000 miles to have it there on your plate. Gives us a little bit more level of appreciation when we understand those sacrifices to bring it about. Trade was important, and again, that's very much a reference to what our contemporary foodstuffs are right now. So actually, that's the site. Does anybody recognize where this is at? It's an artist's depiction, but where would this have taken place? Be historians, be researchers. Who wants to take a shot at it? I have a Reese cup right here, or a Kit Kat, for who could tell me what this is a depiction of. Vanessa, you're gonna take a guess.
No, but in the chat, Dean Barbati, she said Acoma.
No.
No, Pecos.
I would say Pecos, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's Pecos.
This is a depiction of Secuye, which is the name, which was the historical name of Pecos Pueblo. Now, part of a
Zoom lecture, so.
was okay. Yeah, so this is at the Pecos National Monument, National Park right now. This is one of the murals that's there, and it's a depiction of the trade. Remember, we were speaking about Plains Indians that were hunter-gatherers. They were a hunting tradition, and they lived in teepees so they could pick up and move about. Every once in a while, they would come close to the Sangre de Cristo Mountains and trade with the people that lives in cities. And this city had four levels of apartment buildings. It was a huge city, such as Chaco Canyon. And there they would trade. So you could see them. Here's the cornfields, and they were trading corn, squash, pottery, beans were probably in there. There might have been some chocolate, some cacao in there. And here they're trading for turkeys, or look, here's a bald eagle, trading for buffalo hides. So again, you know, these trade and exchange mechanisms become more and more prevalent, and it didn't wait for cars and vehicles and airplanes. These were human conditions, human exchange that had taken place for hundreds of years, thousands of years for that matter. And they brought us the foodstuffs that are right now on our table right now. Eventually, as I say, there's Secuye Pueblo right there. Eventually, the Spanish come into the area and sponsor a second agricultural revolution. Okay? So when the Spanish come to the New World, now many of you that are historians know that the first Spanish exploration into the Southwest, this little golden route right here, were actually some Spaniards that were lost. That was the Cabeza de Vaca expedition. They took 8 years and they wandered all through this area, discovering, if you want to use that word, discover is a kind of a weird word when people are already in existence, but we say they were discovered. Columbus discovered the New World, and the Spanish discovered the Southwest. People were there, so it's probably not a correct term to use. But in their process of inquiry, the Spanish came in and explored much of this area and learned about foodstuffs, plants and animals, and learned about healing traditions as well. And when they made it back to Mexico City in 1536, they told them that what wonderful things there were up there. And they told them stories of gold. They said that their cities made of gold, which we know is untrue. But wait, hold on. There is a cities of gold, huh? Oh, it's a casino. But the Spanish come in and they're exploring. Here they went on one of the Coronado expeditions. They go out way clear out there into contemporary Kansas, into the Llano Estacado, the State Plains. They go all the way out west. They run into the Grand Canyon, find some of the areas, eventually explore California and such. But much of that exploration came into New Mexico, particularly because that's where we had agriculture. And so this begins the big exchange in the second level of agricultural revolution, because the Spanish introduce grapes and turnips and onions, sugarcane, bananas. They bring cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses. They bring the grains, wheat, rice, barley, oats. They brought disease. Let's not forget that. It disseminated much of the population. They brought olives and peaches and coffee beans. The foods that were from the Americas that eventually make their way to Europe and end up impacting European cuisines and European food traditions are those that we know to be indigenous to the Americas. Remember, turkeys are from the Americas. Corn, bean, squash, piña, pineapple, avocados from Mexico. Cassava, peanuts from the Americas, potatoes from the Americas. The potato itself, even prior to corn, the potato impacted the European economy tremendously because it could be grown in in different levels. The potato, there's over 200 different varieties of potatoes, and they could grow up even as high as 14,000 feet elevation. And they're resilient to a lot of different kind of environmental conditions. So corn, bean, squash, vanilla, tomato, peanuts, these are foods from the Americas that impacted the other world. Now, one of the things that is important for us to consider is when the Spanish come into the area, they're bringing Middle Eastern Moorish technology by means of the acequia system, those irrigation channels that the ditches that are very prevalent in many of our New Mexico communities were introduced by the Spanish, and they built on some of the agricultural traditions of Native American, but it caused about an agricultural revolution here in New Mexico. So we have more root crops. We have melons and cantaloupes. At one time, it was banned for the Spanish to bring grapes into the New World, but the Franciscan friars snuck them in. They snuck in grapevines, and eventually we have some really good New Mexico wines that were the dominant, a significant industry in some time. When the Spanish come in and they brought the horses, there's a different kind of hunting practice. The ciboleros were Spanish and Genízaro and Native American that came back to the hunting tradition of the plains groups, but this time they were hunting on horseback. And eventually the Spanish introduced sheep. So sheep impacts heavily in our food traditions. In fact, it's kind of a contradiction to me here. Let me see. Okay. If you think, okay, let me ask this. I'll give you the image, but I'm going to jump back. I got a question. What are the most famous Native American dishes in New Mexico?
Mutton stew.
But mutton is not from the Americas. The sheep were introduced by the Spanish, right?
Yeah, you're right, but they took it up.
What else? What else is is a famous indigenous food. Mutton stew, yes.
Tamales.
Pozole.
Tamal, those are indigenous. Tamales are indigenous. Pozole is indigenous.
Fried bread.
Yeah, but fried bread is from wheat. It's not indigenous. It's from the Spanish introduction. So there's kind of, I'm saying there's kind of a contradiction as to what we consider indigenous Native American food are actually introduced by the Spanish with the sheep and the wheat. And sometimes we go to a restaurant and we say, well, let's go eat Spanish food. And it's corned beans and squash. It's indigenous. So we're getting that a little bit mixed up sometimes. It's just kind of a little idiosyncrasy that goes along with our foodstuffs. But again, so we have some beautiful different developments of cuisines. Eventually, the railroad comes into place. 1870s, 1880s, and the railroad. And I should mention, when the Santa Fe Trail came into place, they brought additional foodstuffs. It wasn't quite as impacting as when the Spanish introduced their foodstuffs. And from that 250-year period between the Spanish colonization, Oñate, and eventually the Santa Fe Trail coming into place, there's really the development of well-established agricultural traditions. And much of that agriculture is still very much on our plates, on our skillets, on our stomachs today. Again, eventually, with the railroad coming into place and refrigeration, some of these cars on the railroad were refrigerated cars. So you had fresh foods being brought in. And with the railroad, as it extends to the California coast and coming back from the California coast in refrigerated, you have the introduction of seafood into New Mexico. Without refrigeration or airplane transport or a real quick transportation mechanism, I'm sorry, you can't have a shrimp shish kebab on your barbecue because that seafood wouldn't last. So eventually, this is what I'm saying. The importance for us to understand is to when these foodstuffs start coming in is because of the different levels of transportation and networking that are taking place. Now, many of you may be familiar with the history of the Castaneda Hotel. The Castaneda, one of the Harvey hotels, becomes very prevalent with the railroad travel coming in, and it significantly impacts foodstuffs and food production and food preparation. So you have the introduction of other different forms, Anglo forms of food cooking, and different kind of foodstuffs with that as well. So part of the idea is, again, going back to my big reference point, that we have some historically traditional foodstuffs that get impacted heavily by means of new foodstuffs coming in. But there's still a core cuisine. And in fact, I should have framed this at the beginning when I started my statement. The word cuisine, the French word of cuisine, it means kitchen and it means culture. And you think about it very much within our own households, probably one of the most important rooms within our homes is not the living room or the dining room, but actually the interaction, the exchange that takes place in the kitchen. Think about your stories, your children's stories. Where do those stories take place? Where is there more of an anchor and a cultural identity as it relates to story tradition if it's not in the kitchen itself? And that's why I'm going back to my initial statements of saying that culture, identity, and food are all interrelated. within the social sciences and academia, we call it, the strategy we use to analyze that is called phenomenology. Phenomenology is one of the areas of philosophy that suggests to us that meaning comes from experience, and experience is most likely associated with physical experience. That's why aromatherapy works, right? Aromatherapy is you smell something and it kicks you back 20, 30, 40 years. That's how powerful that original sensation is. So we could all have stories and images of grandma making tortillas on the stove, or the mutton stew is cooking, and you remember it, and all you need to do is to smell from that recipe again, and it brings it to place. And that's why the best cooking, and you have so many restaurants that say home style cooking, just like mom, just like grandma, because your brain becomes equipped, internalized, and adapted so that you're actually searching for those memories, that nostalgia of having tasted something before. And that's what, you know, from our palate, from our sense of taste, we look to what is the familiar. We look to and gravitate to, I've tasted that before. That's why you might say, no, the recipe is incorrect. You did this wrong. There may not necessarily be a right or a wrong, but we gravitate to the style of food that we were accustomed to because it's deeply embedded within our psyche, within our memory system. So I'm kind of suggesting that this relationship of story, food, and cognition, it's a lot deeper than just saying, no, that was a good taco and it reminded me of home. There's actually some distinct cognitive processes that are taking place. And the manner of how us bringing it out is that's why we use story. Our stories of food are so important to us. Recipes, in some household, recipes are sacred. They don't share them for chance that recipe may be appropriated or incorrectly prepared. And I'm being maybe sexist or stereotypic of saying, grandma would turn over in her grave if she knew that you messed up her sopapillas, even though she provided you with that very tight recipe that didn't say 15 grams of salt, it said a pinch of salt, a smidgen of pepper. O tú sabes un tantito así na. A little bit of this, a little bit of that. It's an art. In many cuisines or many cooking traditions, they're arguing, well, is cooking science or is it art? And I ask you to think about it. Is cooking more of a science or more of an art? Or is it neither one, or is it both? And certainly there's an artistry that goes with it. And we know, I'm not sure how many of you are watching the cooking shows, that they're getting quite creative on the cooking shows and new different types of traditions and such. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. But anyway, one of the other areas of networking and communication that come into place that have a very significant impact on us is the development of Route 66. With Route 66, and this is kind of after the railroad opened up the West to the world and opened up our traditions to the world for all intents and purposes. Some of it gets abused and appropriated. Some of it gets misunderstood and misaligned. But for the better part, our foodstuffs got to be shared with the rest of the United States, and more so with Route 66. Once travel with Route 66 comes into place, we get the introduction to new foodstuffs, and our traditions get shared with a larger population. And with that larger population comes the borderland creativity of, let's do this different. Let's play with this. Let's try a different concoction. And so that's kind of where it brings us more contemporary, that we have a lot of different kind of new venues and new art. I cringed at first when I heard that Taco Bell invented an enchilada. Never quite understood what that was, but I was bothered by it. I said, that's an appropriation. That's non-traditional. There's no adherence. There's no respect. People should choke when they eat that. I reacted pretty heavily because I didn't want to see Taco Bell sponsoring an enchilada. That didn't make sense. It was an abomination. But again, many of our restaurants are playing with those designs. If you're familiar, Edible Magazine, and this is an offshoot of it. This one is called The Bite, and this is a taco edition. It's the cuisine is now playful and it's integrated. You could have a choke cherry frappe, you know, or new combination, new ideas, etc. But we still come down to some of our traditional areas. And this one, I kind of wanted to finalize the presentation. I got a little bit of time here. Chili. And this is foundational. Again, corn, beans, squash, chili, and chocolate. That's it. You got it. You got spice of life. You got everything important. You got the vitamin C. You got the capsaicin. Wake you up in the morning, get you going, and being smiling all day long because you know there's some enchiladas waiting for you at home. But let's be cautious about this and understand the distinction between chilies. Now, here in the Southwest, we play around with as many as 20 to 25 varieties of chili. In Mexico, they have more than 200 types of chilies. Not all these chilies make it up. Now you're getting more inclusion of that, of chilies that are bred specifically for hot. Trinidad Scorpion, Carolina Reaper, Habaneros. And there's actually a scientific scale, the Scoville scale, that's utilized to measure the amount of capsaicin, the amount of picante that's part of chili. Now, not to go heavy into that discussion, but just a real quick statement. Understand that when we speak about Colorado chili, and not chili Colorado, but chili from the state of Colorado, is actually northern New Mexico chili. Genetically, it's the same, raised in the river systems of southern Colorado, and some of them have developed into some quite remarkably tasteful breeds and species of chilies. Myself, I'm partial to this one. This is Pueblo Mirasol. Mirasol because it grows looking to the sol, looking to the sun. And so that's a very, very good chili. So don't get distraught or distracted by this discussion that Colorado chili is terrible and it's going to disrupt our economy. Try it for yourself and compare it. And the comparison would actually be more likely, let's compare southern New Mexico varieties, big farm, big industries, sometimes GMO modified chilies, and those from the north that are heirloom seeds that have been around for quite some time, grown on small farms with cold water irrigation, cool evenings. Those all make a difference when we're talking about chili. There's microenvironments that go on, and you have a combination. If you have a seed that's been in place 300-400 years, that's acclimated to the soil, you have some taste. And so again, we could spend a whole presentation. Actually, maybe I'll design that one out for next year. One that we're just talking about chili by itself. But let me come back to some of the old traditional cooking practices that are finding their way back. Here at Highlands, we've reinvested in looking at some of these old traditions. One of them includes horno cooking. I don't have the images, but just this weekend, we did a chili roast on campus in what we're calling our cultural park. Actually, let me show you. This is the image of our cultural park diagram, and it's pretty much now to completion. And this last weekend in this horno, it's a little bit more This wasn't quite finished when I took the picture, but it's finished and we've already done 3 cooks in it. This weekend, we cooked chicos del horno. In fact, if you drive by the cultural park on the southeast corner of Melody Park, you're going to see we have a ristra of chili hanging and some ristras of chico, corn for chicos, which is maíz concho. Highlands we're reinventing with the matanza. This is a matanza we do with our student groups, our Native American club, our sometimes conservation club and political science club, our Mecha student organization. For years, we were doing our own matanza and doing it in the traditional way. We would do a sheep or a goat, cook it up, do a pig and do an overnight pit cook on it, and then use it in a manner of feeding community. The design was that we gave back to the community, and our matanza is designed as a cambalache, as a potlatch, as a giving away to our community. So we're organizing for one within the next 4 weeks. So if you're available, try to find tickets. We're going to do a distribution of tickets. We have limited tickets available. They will not be for sale. They'll be distributed. But we're going to come back to doing a pit cook. We do maybe about 800 pounds of roast in this big pit. This is what the meat looks like before it goes in. It's a community effort. We do a whole bunch of chicharron as well, different styles. And we're playing with, again, some of these traditions. This is a young lady, Xochitl. I got the pleasure of meeting her. She did a little ristra, and we did this over the weekend. So we're coming back to reinventing some of these traditional cooking methodologies, some of these traditional distribution mechanisms, and doing it in a manner of community and celebration. You could see this line of people that was in place. And we invite you to come and be part of it. Again, this will be October 22nd and 23rd, the Highlands Matanza. Come and break bread, share pan with us, and let's continue our discussion. And please, when you run into me there, bring me a good story, because if you tell me your story, I'll appreciate your character and learn more of your cultural identity. Quedo de ustedes, humilde servidor. Ojalá que haya disfrutado en cuanto a esta la presentación. Thank you very much. I hope you got something out of this presentation. More so, again, this big idea of saying your stories are important, and if your stories recognize the story of food itself, it makes it a lot more tasteful, a lot more meaningful. So hopefully you enjoyed. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Romero.
Do we got time for a comment or a question?
Sure,
I think
of course.
we're the last one today, so we could do that, right?
Yes. If
Let's have a
anybody has
discussion.
any-
Okay, please. I'm sorry, Vanessa.
No, you're fine.
Give me some food stories. I'm really interested.
If anybody wishes to speak, you can unmute or raise your hand, whichever.
I'm going to treat this as a class and call on a space.
Okay, I wanted to give you a story. I have a vat that my grandfather used to make chicharrones in. And it's a great big old cast iron vat. Beautiful.
Ms. Garcia, could you lend that to us for our matanza? Okay, mira, what is your word for that?
I don't know my word for that. It's a
Is
big.
Is it a caso, a perole, a vasine, an olla? We have different kinds.
I would say it's. I don't know if it'd be. Olla is a great big. This is a great big cast iron has 3 little legs on it.
I personally would call that a perole.
Perole. Okay, I never heard that before.
Or sometimes what we have right now is we're for the matanza, we're going to probably set up 7 different stations for chicharron. And right now we have 1 big cast iron, 2 coppers and 2 brass. So we're actually, I wasn't joking. We're looking for another pot if
Well, I have it and it has a lid and it's, if you want to come to Santa Fe and pick it up, you're welcome to use it.
Oh, please and thank you. Can I ask you to give me a number? And I'll
Yes.
check in with you. Or let me give you my number.
You know my
so-
husband, Bill Garcia, right?
Oh, yes, ma'am.
Okay,
Okay. That'll be the contact. Thank you.
you're welcome.
Well, let me ask you, when was the last time you cooked chicharrones in it?
I never have, because it's so big, I wouldn't have enough. I never have. So
That's for cooking industrial sized pigs.
that's for matanzas, definitely.
That's matanza corn.
So yeah, do contact us and we'll make arrangements.
Please and thank you.
And thank you for your presentation. It was excellent.
Gracias. Eric Romero, and if you really want recipes, I'm probably better at story than recipe, but we're sharing recipe. One of the things